Wayne came up and asked me, "What's the title for your lesson?" Said cracks. Cracks are commonly considered to be bad things, aren't they? In most situations, cracks are they desirable or undesirable? The kind of cracks that I am referring to are what we would consider a break. We had a Rockets player this season that a couple of months ago developed a hairline crack, a stress fracture in his right leg. And they almost say it's better to go ahead and have a full break. If you've ever had a stress fracture, it's almost better to have a full break than a stress fracture like he's gone through. A crack appears when something breaks but does not separate. Yet the crack being visible is the proof that the break has occurred. In other words, the crack reveals the break even though there is not full separation. And again, we consider cracks to be not a great thing. So, you guys here tonight, I'm going to start with you. If I told you that I am going to give you a good price on a new automobile, but there is a crack in the engine block, how many of you would want to buy that car, guys? None of you would. If I came up to you, this is for guys or gals. If I came up to you and I said, I have a house that I can sell you that is a real steal, but the reason the price is so low is because the foundation is very cracked. How many of you want to buy that house? All right, ladies, this is just for you. If I came to you tonight and I said, I have got a steal, a great deal on a dozen eggs, but half of those eggs are cracked, how many would want to buy those eggs? You would want to buy those eggs. Now we got the thrifty one over here. All right, we'll keep going. Do you personally want any of these things I'm about to share with you? A cracked tooth. You ever had a cracked tooth? Cracked bone. You ever had a cracked bone? What about a cracked pair of eyeglasses? What about a camera with a cracked lens? A cracked windshield? Cracked window? Cracked skin? Cracked fingernails? Because we associate all these things, these cracks with the undesirable. Did you know that we developed a phrase a long time ago, long before I studied trying to find out where this phrase actually originated, and I could not come to a complete consensus decision, but somewhere along the way, someone originated the phrase falling through the crack. Falling through the cracks. In other words, we're talking about when a person or thing or a situation falls through the cracks. We usually would agree that's never good, right? To say that someone or something fell through the cracks is never a desirable situation. And as a general consensus, the idea has always been to prevent something or someone from falling through the cracks, correct? Now, each of the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, each of those four Gospels acknowledge that Jesus spent a majority of his ministry on this earth spiritually rescuing people, you might say, fell through the cracks. Jesus commonly ministered to people who would be described as having fallen through the cracks. And the list is quite astonishing. Now, if you take the idea and you hear me say falling through the cracks, maybe your question is, Jonathan, what do you mean by people who fell through the cracks? Jonathan, what do you mean by that? I mean people, first and foremost, who were rejected. I'm also talking about people who did not fit in the religious structure of Jesus' day. Jesus taught, Jesus cared for, Jesus healed people for whom there was no help and no hope within Israel's first century establishment. There were people who lived in the first century Israel who did not fit in, who were rejected, and because of Israel's establishment, had no hope in their life. And it's amazing how Jesus provided these individuals hope and rescue when no one else could. You want some examples? I wish I could give you the complete list, but let me tell you something about the Gospels. If they truly contained every time that Jesus performed a miracle or gave hope to someone who fell through the cracks, if it contained every single time, I'm not sure we could write it all or read it all, should I say. But let me give you a few. In the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 8 and verse 1, you don't have to write these down or because I'm going to go quick, okay? Matthew chapter 8 and verse 1, we have the man with leprosy. Matthew chapter 8 and verse 5, we have the centurion and his servant. Matthew chapter 8 and 28, we have the two men with demons. Matthew chapter 9 and verse 9, Matthew, tax collector. Matthew chapter 9 and verse 10, a gathering of tax collectors and sinners. Matthew chapter 9 and verse 20, remember the woman who had the hemorrhage for 12 years, I believe? 9:27, the blind man. 9:32, the demon-possessed man who could not speak. Matthew chapter 12 and verse 22, the demon-possessed man who was blind and speechless as well. Matthew chapter 15 and verse 22, the Canaanite woman's daughter. Matthew chapter 17 and verse 15, the demon-possessed child. Go to the Gospel of Mark. Mark chapter 1 and verse 23. Also, Mark chapter 5 and verse 2, the man with an unclean spirit. There were actually two of those recorded in the Gospel of Mark. One of my favorites, Mark chapter 3 and verse 1, was the man with a withered hand. You remember I spoke about that a few years ago. Mark chapter 10 and verse 46, the blind man. Now the Gospel of Luke. Luke chapter 5 verse 18, the paralyzed man. Luke chapter 7 verse 14 and 15, the man from Nain who's raised from the dead. Luke chapter 7 verse 37, the sexually immoral woman. We studied about her 3 weeks ago. Luke chapter 8 and verse 2, Mary Magdalene. Luke chapter 13 verse 11, the woman who was, lack of better term, bent double, right? What about Zacchaeus? Luke chapter 19 and verse 2. Then you have the Gospel of John, right? John chapter 4, the Samaritan woman. Remember her at the well? John chapter 5 and verse 5, the man who had been sick for 38 years. John chapter 9 and verse 1, the man born blind. Now, maybe your question is, Jonathan, can you tell me, how is it? Why is it that these individuals, you've just given us this, and by the way, it is not a complete list. Again, let me remind you of that. It's not a complete list. I think it's important that you know that it's not a complete list. But why did the people I just shared with you, why did they fall through the cracks? I think that is probably one of the most interesting and worthwhile questions that we could answer as we begin this lesson together tonight. And before I answer that question, who is Jesus? We've been talking about that on Sunday mornings, right? Is Jesus God's son? Yes or no? Yes. Did Jesus perfectly understand God's will and God's purposes? Did he? Yeah, better than anyone. Did Jesus ever say anything during his time here on this earth? Did he ever speak a word, or did he ever do anything that misrepresented God? No. Jesus said, however, that these people should not fall through the cracks. See, Jesus revealed that God cared just as much, listen, this is the key, that God cared just as much about these people as God cared for everybody else. Yet socially and spiritually, the entire religious system of that day allowed for these people to fall through the cracks. Israel's religious system is what made the cracks. Not only did Israel and the religious system of that day not meet these people's needs, but did you know that Israel's religious system taught that God willed, that it was God's will that these people be thus rejected and fall through the cracks? It's hard to think about today, isn't it? Religiously, there was no place for these individuals within their system of religion. This was indeed the basic problem. You see, for a long time, the religious leaders, they would, listen, this is so critical, they would take all of God's teachings and all of God's law, and then they would produce a system. Again, let me tell you, God did not create the cracks. God does not create cracks. Remember, cracks are negative, right? They're harmful. God did not create the cracks. The system created the cracks. Their system said that God did not desire or want certain types of people. Their system said God utterly rejected certain kinds of people. And there was something basically wrong with the system that they created from God's laws and his teachings. Now, who perfectly represented God? Let's answer that question. Who perfectly represented God? Israel's religious system or Jesus? Jesus said God did not reject those people. Jesus in his actions, Jesus in his teaching said God willed to unburden those people and give them hope. Jesus said those people were thus encouraged to come to God and God would welcome them. Jesus went on to say that Israel's system misrepresented God's priorities in his law. Jesus said God's two greatest, most important commandments of the law were what? Matthew 22:37-40. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the great and foremost commandment. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Upon these two commandments depend the whole law and the prophets. Israel's religious system had the idea that love had nothing to do with God's law. It was basically a matter of obedience, not love. Jesus said, though, love for God and love for your fellow man is the foundation of the entire law. In other words, God's law depends on love. They created a problem. And folks, let me tell you, if we're not careful, we can reproduce the same problem as the church of the day when we replace love obedience. Now, listen carefully. When we replace love obedience with system loyalty. System loyalty measures everything with a checklist. How many of you know what a checklist is? So let's consider what would have been a checklist of Israel's religious system. And when we go along, we'll just check each of these, okay? Eat the right foods. Check. Do the right things on the Sabbath day. Check. Keep the religious ceremony of hand washing before you eat. Check. Pray 3 times a day. Check. Offer the right sacrifices. Check. Keep the Passover. Certainly. Check, right? You realize that a devout Jew could have checked everything on that list without any faith, without any love for God, and without any love for his fellow man. You realize it was possible for a Jew to check each of those on that checklist without a single ounce of faith and love for God or love for people. And it happened. It happened. What about a checklist today? Let me ask you, church, do we have any checklists today? Are we going to be honest with each other tonight? Do we have any checklists today? Sure do. Maybe ours would go something like this. Attend church on Sunday. Check. Take communion. Check. Sing a cappella. Check. Give. Check. And then we have a list of don'ts, don't we? That would be in a checklist, right? Drunkenness. Check. Adultery. Check. Lying. Check. Stealing. Check. I mean, I could keep going. Is it possible? I'm going to ask you tonight to think about this. Is it possible that a Christian could check everything on those boxes without faith, without love for God, and without love for other people? Is it possible that we could be checking off those boxes and not truly have the faith that pleases God, the love that pleases God, and the love for others that pleases God? Is it possible? I want to share with you tonight that I think there's a danger sometimes, and I have really challenged myself, especially over the last few years post-COVID, to avoid the temptation of creating checklists. Because I have begun to realize that the more checklists we create, the more opportunity there is for people to fall through the cracks. Let me tell you a quick story. When I was preaching at the Channelview Church of Christ, we had some young families a part of the church that were very, very valuable to that church. And I loved them dearly. And I've been a preacher for a number of years already. And I remember they would be with us on Sunday morning, but a lot of those young families wouldn't be back with us on Sunday night. And some of them weren't with us on a Wednesday night or two. Maybe they came some and would miss some. Jennifer can tell you I became very indignant. Why aren't they here? They should be here. I'm here. They should be here. And I became judgmental. I didn't know their struggles. I didn't consider their struggles. Their struggles were the last thing on my mind. What was most important in that moment was that they did what? Check that box. As I got a little bit older and I looked back on their lives and learned what they were going through, it made me feel about that tall. And what made me feel even shorter was when I wasn't preaching full time for a brief period of time and found myself being the one who had some of those same struggles. See, when someone is troubled, the last thing that we need to do is tell them that they're not following the checklist. The last thing that we need to do is tell them, well, you know what? Christians don't have those kind of troubles. Christians follow the system and Christians check the checklist. If you do that, though, what's going to happen to troubled people in your church? They're going to fall through the cracks. When someone is burdened in their heart, emotionally, and trust me, church, we have people all the time in our churches that are burdened emotionally. The last thing that they need to hear from us, you know what? If you're a Christian, you won't have those kind of struggles emotionally. Depression, oh, a real Christian wouldn't have that. The last thing that we need them to hear, follow the system, follow the checklist. Because if you do, what's going to happen is those burdened people are going to fall through the cracks. Systems that rely on checklist create cracks. And the result is struggling people will fall through those cracks. God's love, and this is the best part of the lesson for me to share with you tonight. God's love and God's forgiveness, trust me when I tell you, have no cracks. You realize that? It has no cracks for anyone who repents, for there are no cracks for that person to fall through. Godliness, church, is based not on a checklist, but on a committed heart relationship to Jesus Christ. Love will never be able to be reduced truthfully down to a checklist. What are programs? How many of you have ever been a part of a program in a church? Programs are sometimes used by churches to help fill the cracks where a failure to love would be filling those cracks. I want to share with you as I close a illustration. Raise your hand if you're in this room, if you've ever been married or you're married right now. You have this couple and they've been married for a short while. Every single day, though, the wife is becoming more and more exasperated. So one evening about 7 p.m., she says to him, her husband, "Okay, big man, it's time for you and I to have a little talk. Sit down and listen to me and hear me. You know, I thought you'd catch on. I thought in this marriage you would catch on, but no way. Nothing is changing around here. So here's what's going to happen. I'm going to make you a checklist. And if you love me, You will follow that list every single day. Are you ready, church, for the checklist? Number one, you will take the garbage out. Number two, you will pick up your dirty clothes. Number three, you will take your shoes off when you come in our house. Number four, you will hang up your towel after you use it. Number five, you will lift the seat. You know what seat I'm talking about, right? And you will lower that seat. Number six, you will keep me informed about your whereabouts at all times. Number seven, you'll do everything on this list. Or number eight, I'm out of here. Now, I think that you're smart enough to understand something. If you take a marriage like that and you reduce it to a system of conduct, a checklist, you know what's going to happen to that marriage? It's going to die. The man and the woman, they may continue to live in this under the same roof, but that marriage is going to die. Most certainly it will. Two things. Marriage must be responsible. We all agree with that, right? Marriage must be responsible. But what is the foundation of the marriage? Love. You see, when our spiritual existence is reduced to a system and a checklist, you know what happens to Christianity? You know what happens to our churches? Just like the marriage, right? Without love, we die. We perish. Yeah, I mean, we may continue to be a congregation and go through what's regarded as the necessary motions, but our relationship with God and Jesus Christ will slowly and surely die without love. Love for God, love for each other, and love for the people in this world. See, when you love God, when in love, you responsibly maintain a relationship to God through repentance and of devotion, brotherly love to each other, you will never fall through the cracks, and others will not fall through the cracks, for there will be no cracks. A lot to think about. But I'll end by saying, I've been in the church for my entire life, and I know many of you have been in the church for a majority of your life. You ever known anybody to fall through the cracks? Yeah. If there's any regret I have of 28 years of ministry, it's that I haven't done more to prevent people falling through the cracks. Because it was Jesus who spent a majority of his time on this earth rescuing those who are without hope, who felt no love, who had fallen through the cracks. If I'm going to be Christ-like, I ought to make that my concern as well. We're going to sing this song of encouragement tonight, and it is an opportunity to be there for each other as the body of Christ. If there be thus any needs tonight that we can assist you with, and prayer, encouragement. If you're not a Christian tonight, the opportunity to put on Christ in your life, it's so much more than a checklist. It's a love relationship with God through Jesus Christ. If we can assist you in any way, come as we're led in this song together.